Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into something I think we've all noticed, these really rapid cultural obsessions, societal manias, maybe?
Exactly. And we're going to be leaning heavily on insights from Lionel Shriver. She talked about this quite a bit in a trigonometry interview discussing her book Mania and, well, the social hysterias she sees around us.
Right. So, our mission here is to try and understand how these things, these cultural waves, take hold and get so big so fast.
Yeah, we'll look at some recent examples Shriver brought up, use her perspective, hopefully give you a kind of framework for thinking critically about how these trends pop up, dominate everything for a while, and then sometimes just fade away.
Should be interesting. Expect some surprising takes, I think, a new lens on things.
Definitely.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning. What does Shriver actually mean by a societal mania? What's her definition?
Well, it's pretty stark, actually. She describes it as basically when a whole culture just gets completely consumed by one idea or maybe a practice.
Consumed. Okay.
Yeah, and the really key thing now, she feels, is the speed. It seems to take less and less time for these things to take over. Technology, obviously, playing a huge role.
So ideas can just grab hold and warp the culture incredibly quickly.
That's the fear she expresses, that ideas have this power to, well, contort things almost overnight. It's kind of unsettling.
She even uses World War II as a sort of extreme example historically of cultural contortion by an ideology, which is, yeah, pretty intense.
It is a sobering comparison.
So moving to more recent times, what specific examples does she point to? Where does she start?
The first one she really flags is transgenderism, how quickly it seemed to emerge into the mainstream conversation.
Okay.
And she points out it wasn't just the topic itself, but how quickly criticism became, well, almost taboo. Like you couldn't even ask questions without risking your career, potentially.
That silencing aspect is key then.
She sees it as a potential sign, yeah.
Mhm.
When dissent gets shut down that fast, maybe that's a symptom of a mania taking hold.
Interesting. Especially coming from her, known for being outspoken.
Yeah.
She mentioned feeling that pressure herself.
She did. She talked about that period with the intense media focus, the little boys in dresses thing, and feeling hesitant to weigh in directly then.
Mm-hmm.
Though she did mention an essay she wrote way back in 2016, I think, for Prospect about androgyny. She saw that as an earlier, maybe riskier comment on related ideas.
Right, I remember reading about that. Okay, what other shifts caught her eye?
Next up, Black Lives Matter. Her observation there was just the sheer explosion of it almost overnight, she said, after George Floyd's death, and how it went international so quickly.
Well, it was everywhere.
Exactly. And that's relevant to the mania idea because it spread even to places with, basically no black population.
Yeah.
South Korea was her example.
Wow. Okay.
Which just shows how information and that collective focus can just blanket the globe now, a key feature of these modern manias, perhaps.
That speed of global spread.
Yeah,
That really highlights the role of digital media, doesn't it?
absolutely.
So what came after that period?
Then COVID-19. She frames the whole pandemic response as a kind of major mania, but one that also spawned, like, submanias
Submanias, like what?
around vaccines, masks, the lockdowns themselves. The really striking thing for her was locking people in their homes. Just how unprecedented that was on a global scale.
Yeah, that was something else. Not much history to draw on for that.
Very little. And she sees that adoption of really extreme, previously unthinkable measures as another potential marker of mania.
And it wasn't just the policies, was it? She talked about the social side, too, the atmosphere.
Oh, definitely. She found it quite chilling the way people turned on each other, neighbors, friends.
Mm-hmm.
If you didn't toe the line, you were sort of cast out, often with this real sense of moral righteousness.
Mm-hmm.
She even used words like religious fervor,
Mm.
ideas of purity, contamination, self-sacrifice.
Mm.
It became really prominent, didn't they?
You could definitely see that language being used.
Yeah. And she contrasts that intense pressure to conform with places like Florida or South Dakota, which took a different path. She questions whether the extreme measures actually produce better outcomes in the end.
And she made a point about language, too, didn't she? About the word liberal.
She did. How it seemed to become almost illiberal to criticize Florida's approach, for example, a kind of linguistic shift reflecting the tension.
Interesting observation. Okay, and the last specific mania she discussed?
That was me too. She acknowledged its starting point, holding people accountable for, actual misconduct.
Sure.
But she felt it quickly broadened out, became, in her view, a bit indiscriminate sometimes.
How so?
Well, the perception, she said, that it could be weaponized. used for revenge or even just self-promotion, and this pressure on women to sort of have an abuse story to tell, to be part of the moment.
Right. So the idea that even well-intentioned movements can morph in unexpected ways within that manic energy.
That seems to be the point, yeah. How they can evolve and maybe lose their initial focus.
Okay, so if we take all these examples, transgenderism, BLM, COVID, Me Too, what's the big picture takeaway for Shriver? The common thread.
For her, it demonstrates our collective capacity to, well, she says, lose our minds, to get so swept up in an idea that we lose perspectives. Critical thinking goes out the window, and dissent just isn't tolerated.
Right. Now, the conversation then shifted a bit, didn't it? The interviewer pushed back on whether this is really just a human thing or if it's more political.
Yeah, that was an interesting exchange. Shriver's initial stance is that mania itself isn't left or right. It's just something humans do.
But the interviewer pointed out,
That all the examples she gave seemed to come from the left. He basically asked, where's the right-wing mania in all this?
in her response,
She conceded that, yeah, looking at recent social medias, they have seemed to originate largely from the left.
okay,
And she said that's partly why, in her novel, she invented her own mania, this mental parody movement, set back in an alternative 2011. It gave her control, let it predate the ones we've just discussed.
so she could explore the mechanism without getting bogged down in current politics.
Exactly. And it's a fascinating little detail in her fictional world. The push for gay marriage hadn't even happened because this other mania took over first.
Interesting. What about the interviewer's point about Trump? Did they discuss the feeling around that administration?
They did. The interviewer mentioned the sort of manic feeling people described around Trump, especially the media portrayal of this weird frenzy, the rush of executive orders.
Did Shriver agree?
She acknowledged there was definitely a sense that they felt their time was short. Whether that was objectively true or not, that feeling of urgency of a closing window can contribute to a kind of frantic atmosphere, maybe regardless of ideology.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's pivot now to the people within these manias. Shriver has this character, Emery, in the book. Tell us about her.
Right, Emery. She's portrayed as super smart, talented, good-looking, charismatic, but also deeply cynical underneath it all. And Shriver sees characters like Emery as representative of people who often thrive during these manias. You know the type you watch them, and you can't quite tell if they genuinely believe the rhetoric or if they're just incredibly good at figuring out which way the wind is blowing and, well, riding the wave for personal gain.
The opportunists, careerists, maybe.
That's the idea. And she makes this really interesting, maybe counterintuitive point. It's often the intellectual class, the people you might think would resist, who jump on board early and enthusiastically.
Why would that be?
Because, she argues, they're better at rationalizing. The smarter you are, the better you are at building complex arguments to justify, well, almost anything, even if the foundation is shaky.
I see.
They can quickly see where the advantages lie in a new mania, align themselves, become the loudest voices. She even mentioned, sort of darkly, the way the word retarded reappeared in some online circles, almost celebrated ironically, how intellectuals can sometimes embrace problematic stuff with this kind of detachment.
Wow. Okay. But the book isn't just about society-level stuff, right? It gets personal. Friendships.
Absolutely. A big part of mania is about how these things strain relationships. What happens when friends react differently? One goes along, the other resists.
And Shriver's experienced that herself.
She said so, yeah.
Yeah.
Losing friends, often those further left politically, during these periods, feeling like you become toxic or a career risk just for having a different opinion.
That's tough. When the public stuff bleeds into your private life like that.
It really is. It forces people to take sides sometimes. Makes it hard to even talk about sensitive things like race, even with people you're close to. This feeling of always having to watch your mouth.
Yeah.
And she contrasts her main character, who she says isn't super high IQ, maybe an 07, but just cannot stand bullshit, with people who might be smarter but are more willing to just go along with things.
Yeah.
Her character hits a point where she just can't accept what she sees as obvious truths being denied. The can a man be a woman kind of breaking point.
Which brings us to the question of what you do when you're in the middle of one of these. Is just staying quiet, the agnostic route, as she calls it, a valid option?
Well, she has a character who does that. It's the protagonist's partner. And Shriver acknowledges, look, for self-preservation, staying silent can make sense. It's understandable given the pressures. But there's a catch, right?
Yeah.
If everyone stays silent, then nothing changes. Bad ideas don't get challenged. She mentioned writing an anti-lockdown piece early on and the flack she took for it. Being ahead of the curve often means paying a personal price.
Yeah, she mentioned David Starkey, too, the historian.
Yeah.
The lasting damage from perceived missteps.
Exactly. It shows the real cost of resistance for some people.
And she seems temperamentally unsuited to just conforming.
That's how she puts it. Almost like a medical immunity. She just can't help but react against what she sees as collective delusion. But she's very aware that this immunity leads to isolation. And she mentions the free rider problem. Basically, conformity only really works out for the individual if enough other people are willing to stick their necks out and resist.
It's not all doom and gloom, though. She did see some positives coming out of what she calls the woke thing.
She did. One point was that it's forced some people to really stand up for what they believe in, take risks, even when it's lonely and there's no obvious personal benefit, to distinguish themselves through conviction.
Okay.
And she also highlighted the role of things like podcasting, providing spaces where dissent can happen, where alternative views get aired outside of the mainstream, perhaps.
That's definitely been a shift.
Yeah, and she finds encouragement just knowing there are people capable of independent thought. And again, she stresses it's often temperament, that gag reflex against nonsense, more than just raw intellect that helps people resist.
Okay, now back to the novel, The Mania. It shows this overcorrection where IQ becomes this huge fixation. Does she see parallels to that happening now in reality?
She suggests we might be seeing signs of an overcorrection, yeah, especially in the reactions against some of the trends she's described.
But she's worried about how it's happening.
Her concern is that it could be clumsy, maybe too extreme, and that could cause a backlash, a boomerang effect that ends up strengthening the very things people are reacting against.
And the other side can then say, see, we told you so.
Exactly. She notes how some on the left might frame any overcorrection as proof their initial warnings were right, they really are fascists or whatever. But she also admits it's hard to point to really concrete examples of this overcorrection just yet. It's maybe still emerging.
One major casualty in all this seems to be trust. Trust in experts, institutions.
Yeah, she talked quite a bit about that erosion of trust, how the left historically often used the all the scientists agree line to push consensus on things like vaccines, climate change, even, she argues, controversially, the Russian disinformation narrative.
And the effect of that.
She believes that constantly leaning on this idea of monolithic expert agreement, especially when dissent gets squashed, has actually backfired. It's damaged the credibility of those very institutions for a lot of people.
Leading to the opposite reaction sometimes.
Right, this counter trend where some people almost assume dissent equals truth, which is also risky, obviously. She mentioned criticism of someone like Douglas Murray, based purely on credentials, ignoring the substance of his arguments.
It's a tricky balance, isn't it? You don't want blind faith, but you can't just dismiss all expertise.
Absolutely not. She uses a really personal example, her daughter having epilepsy. You need to trust doctors in that situation.
Of course.
But then she points to other examples, like junior doctors in the UK seemingly denying basic biology about sex, where it looks like expertise has been compromised by ideology.
So expertise can be corrupted, as she puts it.
That's her view. She also talks about the perception that media outlets, scientific journals even, have been captured by certain viewpoints. So you get this single expert voice promoted, and dissent, say on climate change nuances, gets shut down.
Which suggests insecurity, maybe, if you have to shut down debate.
That's her implication. If your position is solid, you shouldn't be afraid of discussion. She emphasizes we need to differentiate gravity is real, that's solid consensus. Other areas are more complex, involve bias.
So it comes back to individual judgment again.
Yes. Critical thinking, trying to weigh the evidence yourself, which is harder than ever.
Especially with the media landscape now.
Right. Driven by clicks, entertainment. Truth can feel secondary sometimes. The internet created this potential for echo chambers, my truth, instead of the truth. We naturally seek confirmation, avoid things that challenge us.
It takes effort to break out of that.
Real discipline, she says. And the left-right polarization doesn't help. People adopt these set menus of opinions. You have to think this about Ukraine if you think that about climate change. She urges avoiding sides, this groupsterism.
Okay, so given all this complexity, this human tendency, can we actually manage mania? Can we learn?
She sounds pretty skeptical about us learning collectively.
Yeah,
Uses a swarm analogy, we just kind of follow the impulse.
Not hugely optimistic, then.
Not entirely, but she does offer some individual strategies, things you can do.
Like what?
Prioritize thinking for yourself, obviously. Be aware that social hysteria is a real thing. Notice when things just start to feel Weird. When new rules or taboos pop up suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere.
Trust that, hang on, this is strange feeling.
Yes. Question sudden, overwhelming consensus. Question radical shifts, especially things like interventions on young people. Keep your weirdness antenna tuned, she says.
And it's not just about being smart, it's temperament again.
Right, she goes back to that. It's not just intellect, it's that resistance to swallowing, well, bollocks, as she puts it. The ability to rationalize is powerful. You can convince yourself of anything.
She also revisited the core idea in her book's fictional Mania, the mental parity movement. There was a valid point underneath it.
Yeah, she acknowledges that. The underlying idea that it's not right to mistreat people just because they have lower intellectual capacity is fair. Intelligence is like height or eye color, mostly innate, not something you earn.
But she critiques where that idea can lead.
Yes, she critiques what she sees as a left-wing obsession with a certain kind of equality that ends up demanding a devastating leveling, a rejection of human difference, variation in talents.
Not her preference.
She prefers a world where success, and therefore also failure, are possible. She contrasts that with a vision of society that might be equally resourced but is uniformly submediocre. She finds that socialist vision sort of anti-human, fundamentally.
Okay. Now, towards the end of the interview, she was asked that classic question. What's the one big thing we're not talking about enough?
Yes. Her answer was quite specific. The asylum system.
The asylum system. Why that?
She argued, we need to seriously question it. That it was designed for a post-WWII reality and is now basically broken. Used mostly for economic migration, widely abused, maybe even harming actual refugees.
That's a strong critique.
It is. She also linked it to broader concerns about mass migration, specifically from the global south to the west. She feels the pace is too fast, causing social division, cultural dilution. She mentioned Muslim factionalization in the UK as an example.
So her view is, slow it down.
Yes. Slow down migration. She actually praised Trump's border closure efforts in the U.S., seeing the Biden approach as socially and economically damagingly open. For the UK, she wants control back over immigration to allow for assimilation, create a more unified country.
Definitely a less commonly aired perspective in mainstream discussion. Okay. So, wrapping this up. Quite a journey through Shriver's ideas on societal manias. We've looked at her definition, her examples, transgenderism, BLM, COVID, Me Too, the politics, the individuals, the personal cost.
Yeah, the role of opportunists, the challenges of resistance, those potential glimmers of hope, the worry about overcorrection, the whole crisis of trust and expertise. It's a lot to take in.
And potential strategies for navigating it all, even her final point about the asylum system.
It really highlights, doesn't it, the need for critical thinking,
Yeah.
for independent judgment, trying to keep your own perspective when everyone seems to be swept up in the same current.
Absolutely. So maybe here's a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. Thinking about how these trends seem to cycle, how powerful collective belief is. What things do we take for granted right now? What unquestioned assumptions might look like a kind of mania when people look back in 20, 30, 50 years?
That's a good question to ponder. What are the potential long-term consequences of the ideas we currently treat as sacred?
Something to reflect on. Thanks for joining us for the deep dive.